So, to get started, I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories that those who know me best have heard way too many times and are very, very sick of, the story of Albert DJ Cashier. So this story starts in 1862, August to be precise. The Union Army is getting pretty desperate. The war's been on for over a year. It's not looking great. And in particular, they're desperate for more soldiers. And in this small town of Belvedere, Illinois, they begin recruiting for Company G of the Illinois 95th Infantry. And one of their recruits is 19-year-old Albert Cashier. Some of the things that pop up most frequently when I read about Albert Cashier, and especially reading first-hand accounts from people who fought with him and people who knew him after the war, the two things that they seem to mention the most are, first, that he was very short. He was 5'3" in his prime. By the time he got up there in age, he was like barely 5 feet tall. So very short man. And he was very Irish. He was described as having a rich Irish brogue. So that gives you an idea of what this 19-year-old kid kind of looked like, who showed up in Belvedere and decided he was going to join the Union Army. Well, at this point in the war, as I said, they are very desperate for volunteers, especially in this small Illinois town, apparently, because the required medical exams that were required for soldiers entering the army were pretty laid back. According to the accounts of other men who served in Cashier's company, all that was required of them was to show their hands and their feet. So it was a very, very low bar. They, essentially the surgeons were kind of just like, just leave all your clothes on. Don't tell us if you have any weird diseases or anything. Just like, do you have enough fingers to fire a gun and 2 feet to stand on? That was all they cared about. So Albert Cashier passed pretty easily, as most people would. He is mustered into the service in early September of 1862. He trains at a camp called Camp Fuller in Rockford, Illinois. And then his regiment, the 95th, begins heading south towards Mississippi because they are gearing up for the siege of Vicksburg. That is one of the most notable battles Cashier served in. He, by the time the war had ended, had served in about 40 engagements. That is probably the most well-known. Before they get to Vicksburg, they stop at a camp in Jackson, Tennessee. And while they're in camp in Jackson, Tennessee, these rumors start spreading around the regiment. See, there's a rumor that a woman has infiltrated their ranks. Outrageous. And one of the sergeants gets word of it, so he decides to test it out. So he goes up to this small gathering of soldiers, probably sitting around a fire making their dinner or something, and he thinks that in this group of soldiers, he thinks the supposed woman might be with them. So what he does, he starts throwing apples at them. He goes up to these guys with a basket of apples, and he throws an apple to each guy. And these guys don't really know what's going on. They don't really think much of it. I'm like, okay, sergeant's handing out apples. This is kind of weird, but he watches and observes how each guy catches the apple, and the majority of them pass the test. They catch it in their hands like that, or maybe between their knees. And that's that. Nothing out of the ordinary. But one soldier does something different. This soldier makes this weird reach down towards his knees. Because this was the woman, and her instinct was to reach and catch this apple in her apron, which of course she wasn't wearing. So that revealed her, and she is kicked out of the regiment. And it becomes a whole scandal. She was not a part of Albert's company, but she was a part of the same regiment, and everyone in the regiment heard about this. Everyone's just like, oh God, can you believe this woman thought she could fool us? How crazy is that? She barely lasted 2 months. This happened in November of '62, so they'd only been in the service a couple months. Meanwhile, Albert Cashier, you can only imagine, is off to the side, keeping his mouth shut.
Oh yeah, wow, that's crazy. Woman soldier. Who would have thought of that? She can't fool us.
Yep. Albert Cashier was himself a woman, or at least he was female. More recently, there have been those that will suggest that by today's terms, he may be classified as transgender. I don't know if that's the best description, just because that wasn't really a term that existed back then. But what we do know is that he was born female, and he lived, as I'll go on to describe, he lived a significant portion of his life as Albert, a young man. And so for that reason, I generally refer to him using male pronouns, because it seems that that's really how people tended to see him and probably how he saw himself. So unlike this other woman who gets caught 2 months in, Albert makes it through the entire war. This is the only recorded case, of a female soldier that made it through the entire war without getting caught. There were, in fact, hundreds of women who served in the Civil War, and there's been a lot of great scholarly works written on them over the years. But within that, only one has been found to have made it through a full 3-year term in the Army, and that is Albert Cashier. One of probably the most famous stories that likes to pop up when reading about him, people love to tell that one time when they were in battle, their flag was shot down by the enemy, and apparently Albert, he ran over and he picked it up and he climbed up a tree and hung the flag over the highest branch, which apparently was very brave and earned him distinction. Another story, my personal favorite, is one where I think it was at Vicksburg, but I'm not 100% sure. And so his company was advancing on the enemy. And up ahead of them, they come across this place where 3 dead trees have fallen across the path and kind of piled on top of each other, and they're blocking their path. And the Confederate soldiers up ahead of them get down behind the trees so that they're out of sight. Albert's company, they kind of stop. They're not really sure. They can't really keep going forward. They don't know what to do. So they kind of stand there. And apparently, Albert gets impatient and he runs forward, climbs up on top of these logs, and he looks out in front of him and basically says something along the lines of like, "You damn cowards, get up here so we can fight you." That's not an exact quote, but that was the gist of it. I can only imagine he was a very easy target, but he managed to escape getting shot, and he climbed back down and went on to continue fighting in the battle. So those are some of his war stories. War ended in '65, and Albert Cashier was mustered out of the service in August of that year, 3 years and 12 days after he first joined. And after the war, he goes back to Illinois. He moves around for a little bit, does some different stuff, and in 1869, he settles in the town of Sonneman, a small little village in Livingston County, Illinois. He goes on to live in Sonneman for the next several decades. For a while, he lives with a family called the Chesbros, who he becomes very close with. He lives with them and he works on their farm, but he's also described by a lot of the members of the family as being sort of like a part of their family. The way I see it, he was kind of like their weird cousin, not technically that closely related to him, but he was always hanging around the house and they kind of, they liked him. Alongside working on their farm, he would also watch their children a lot, which surprised me initially when I heard it, because by most accounts, at least with adults, he was very socially awkward, very antisocial and quiet and kind of strange. So maybe my first thought as a parent wouldn't necessarily be like, this is a good man to leave my children with. But apparently he actually was really good with children. One of his neighbors recalls that he used to just come over to visit her at her house sometimes, and he would just pick up her crying infant daughter and rock her to sleep better than she, as the mother, could. So he loved children. Fun fact there. Other things he did in Sonneman, he was a church janitor for a time, he was a lamplighter. He really just kind of worked odd, miscellaneous jobs around the town to earn his living. In 1885, the Chesbros built him a little house down the street from them, a little one-room cabin, which is still standing to this day, actually. And he lived out his days pretty quietly there. In 1890, he applies for a veteran's pension with the help of his neighbor, a man named Marshall Paddock. Albert himself couldn't read or write, which does make him a little bit frustrating to study from a historian's perspective, because he left behind no journals or letters or any really direct quotes that we can look at. But with the help of this man, Marshall Paddock, he applies for his veteran's pension. And he qualifies. All that was really required was that you served a certain amount of time, I think it was a year, but I'm not certain, in the war, and that you were honorably discharged. Both conditions which he met. So the Pension Bureau replies back to him, sent him some forms to fill out, and basically say, like, yeah, great, you qualify for a pension. All you've got to do is fill out these forms and go get a medical exam. But there's the problem. He's not going to get no medical exam, for obvious reasons. So he puts it off for 9 years. He doesn't get his pension in that time because the exam is mandatory. But if you spend time, as I have, going through his pension file, you will see that over this time the Pension Bureau is kind of sending him these reminders like, hey man, you qualify for this pension, just go get a medical exam. Claimant refuses to comply with order for medical exam. So that goes on for 9 years. And then in 1899, by that point, he would have been in his late 50s. His health was really declining. He really couldn't do any manual labor anymore, and he didn't really have any other job skills. So he really needed this pension to support himself. He finally breaks down and he agrees to get the medical exam. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, you're probably thinking, okay, well, here we go. This is where he gets caught. But he doesn't. I have read the forms filled out by the doctors at this medical exam, and I will spare you the details because let's just say it was a very thorough exam and they leave nothing out. But somehow, in the course of this thorough examination, they fail to notice one crucial detail, that Albert Cashier is not male. It just doesn't come up. I don't know how. There's been some speculations that maybe the doctors did notice, but they just didn't say anything. I, however, think that's unlikely. I think he got really lucky. They didn't notice. And he had by that point lived such a long life as a man, it just wasn't even something that was on their minds. So he passes his medical exam, and he gets his pension, and another 12 years pass. Life goes on, and he continues really to just be someone unremarkable. Until 1911. In 1911, he is hit by a car, and he breaks his leg. And this is when it is revealed, at last. When he is taken to the town doctor to have his leg treated, it's discovered that Albert Cashier, who by this point has been living in this town of Sonneman for 45 years, just about 45 years. He's a pretty solid part of this community. Everyone around there really knows him and has only ever seen him as Albert. And so it comes as a big shock when they realize, oh my gosh, Albert's not a man. At least not physically. Surprisingly, his neighbors and the people who do find out actually are pretty respectful of him, and they keep it quiet. They try not to make a huge deal out of it. But unfortunately, after this accident, he's left pretty disabled. He already was not in great health. He has no wife, no children, no relatives of any kind that can take care of him. So he is sent to a nursing home. The nursing home he ends up at is called the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Quincy, Illinois. is a nursing home specifically for veterans. And at that point in time, it was exclusively a men's facility. Not long after this, I think around 1914, 1915, they did end up opening it up to veterans as well as their wives. But at that point, it was only veterans, which would mean only men. Albert applies to admission at this nursing home with the help of a man named Ira Lish, who was actually the person who hit Albert with his car, but evidently felt very bad about it. He also was a good friend of Albert's. He had known him for many, many years. Ira Lish, had lived himself in Sonneman for a long time. And then on top of that, he was a very prominent politician in the area. He was a senator on the Illinois state legislature. So he had a fair amount of influence. So with Ira Lish's help, Albert gets into this nursing home, and it's unclear whether or not the nursing home knew from the outset that this patient was female, or whether they were just left to find out on their own. But whatever the case, they, just like Albert's neighbors, didn't really make a huge deal out of it. They just let him keep doing what he'd been doing for 50 years, living his life as Albert. Around this time, though, his story is starting to spread. People are hearing about it and talking about it. And so he starts getting asked, why did he choose to live this way? Why did he join the Union Army dressed as a man all those years ago? Why did he keep living as a man after that? At the end of the day, we don't know, because Albert Cashier, even before his secret was revealed, had a reputation for being very evasive when asked questions about his past, and generally, he tended to tell everybody a different story. He mentioned something about having a twin brother, and that their mother used to dress them both as boys, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because I feel like that would make it more confusing. There's also been speculation, well, maybe the twin brother died and Albert was supposed to be like a replacement. That one's likely not true. It's probably just something he made up. Another story he tells is that he, as a child, was living in New York with his stepfather, and his stepfather wanted him to get a job at a factory because the family was very tight on money and they needed everyone who could work to be working. But they wouldn't hire this young girl to work at the factory. So his stepfather cut his hair, dressed him in boys' clothes, and introduced him as his son Albert, and got him a job at this factory. So that's a possibility. We've found no evidence really to confirm that, however. My favorite story, by far, that he's told is, he says he dressed as a man and joined the Union Army to be with his lover, who was also joining the army. But his lover, you see, died a year into the war, and this lover, who's never been named, on his deathbed, made his dear love swear that she would be true to him and never wear a dress again. And I'm sorry, but that's a story I gotta call BS on, Albert. First of all, no evidence that he had a lover. Second of all, even if he did have one we just didn't know about, why was that his dying wish? Like, this guy's dying in the Civil War, and he's saying goodbye to his lover, and his dying thoughts are not, maybe to say, I love you, or say, never love anyone else, always be true to me, or, maybe get the fuck out of the army, like, you're gonna die if you stay here. No, his dying thoughts are, you know what, dear? You look really nice in those pants. You should just stick with that. So, it's highly unlikely that that story is true. Evidence suggests that it's just something he made up because it was the kind of story people wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear that he just felt like disguising himself as a guy. He just liked living that way. They wanted a good reason, so he gave them one. A fake one, but a reason. The most likely tale that he told, and I personally believe this is at least closest to the truth. He says that he his whole life had been working on farms, especially he worked as a sheep herder for his uncle in Ireland for a long time. And so that was really his only job skill. And after his mother died, he went to America and he went west looking for work. But nobody wanted to hire this young girl to work as their farmhand. So he tried his luck by disguising himself as a boy. He cut his hair, donned a pair of men's trousers, and introduced himself as Albert. And it worked. He got a job on this farm in Belvedere, Illinois, working for a man named Mr. Avery. And he worked there for about a year until the war started. And when the war started, all the other boys his age were going off to join the army, and it sounded exciting. And he wanted a piece of that. He figured, I mean, I've made it this far without getting caught. Why not try my luck in the army? And on top of that, it paid more than he was making working on that farm, so what did he have to lose? So he joined, and as we can see, it worked. He never got caught. As to why he kept up this disguise or lifestyle after the war, we don't know. And we never really will know. But he did. It's how he lived his life, and it's pretty remarkable when you think about it. So, to tell you how the story ends, this is where it does get a little sad. So, 1911, he's admitted to this nursing home. He stays there for about 2 years, and then in 1913, that's when shit hits the fan. And really, everything in his life starts to kind of fall apart. Upon his arrival at the nursing home in 1911, was already suffering from dementia. By today's standards, he quite likely would have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So, in his 2 years there, his mental condition continued to decline. He would be very confused and irritable, and oftentimes didn't understand where he was or what was going on. And so he was very difficult to deal with, and really wasn't capable of making decisions for himself. So in 1913, on account of that, he was declared insane by the state of Illinois. Here's the part about that that really gets me upset. When he was declared insane, they had to appoint a conservator, someone who was responsible for his money. All his money, all his property, and making important decisions about what happened to him. And they had so many good options. They could have chosen Ira Lish, who I mentioned earlier, who was an influential politician, a resident of Sonneman, had known Albert for years and was a good friend of his. But they didn't pick him. They could have picked another man, Leroy Scott. Leroy Scott was a retired lawyer. He was also a veteran of the Civil War. He hadn't known Albert during the war, but they met at Veterans Home, and Scott really took a liking to him, and they became friends, and he really looked out for Albert in his time there. So they could have picked Leroy Scott to be his conservator. But no, they didn't. They could have picked one of the Chesbrough sisters. That was the family who he worked for when he was in Sonneman, and who literally described him as being like a part of their family. But they didn't pick them either. They picked a man named W.J. Singleton, who was a banker from Quincy, Illinois, that had never met Albert Cashier in his life prior to this, his being declared insane. His only interest in the case was that now he's in charge of this guy's property. He had no personal connection to it. And I really think that it skewed his decision making in a not good way. So a year after this, a year after he's declared insane, the nursing home gets tired of putting up with Albert's bullshit. He's just continuing to worsen in his mental state. He's continuing to be difficult to deal with, and they're just done with it. So they decide to admit him to an insane asylum. And His conservator, Singleton, having no personal interest in the case, is like, sure, makes sense. Probably be cheaper to keep him there. Go ahead, do it, I don't care. So they admit him to an insane asylum in the spring of 1914. The other thing that happened in 1913, to backtrack a little bit, is slightly less sad. It does have some happy bits to it. So his story by this point has continued to spread, and it's made national news. And it catches the attention of a lot of people. Among them, some of the officials at the Pension Bureau, from whom he's been collecting a veteran's pension for the last 14 years. Well, when they hear about this story, that this veteran that they've been paying is a woman, their thought is that this could be an identity thief, that this isn't the real Albert that fought in the war and earned a pension. This elderly, insane woman at the nursing home in Quincy, Illinois, is just someone who's stolen his name to get the pension. So they launch an investigation into his case. However, the story had also caught the attention of several of Albert's comrades, the men who fought with him in the war. He hadn't spoken to any of them since after the war, hadn't seen them in years, but when they hear about this story, they come forward and they go to see for themselves if it's true. So several of them come to the nursing home and then later to the asylum to visit him and report back to the Pension Bureau. They're asked to testify to the Pension Bureau, and they unanimously report that that insane person at the nursing home is 100% Albert Cashier, the same person that they served with. They hadn't known at the time that he was a woman, but they know that it's the same person. And so the investigation is closed, and he's allowed to keep his pension. Some of his comrades continued to visit him even after that. Two in particular that really took an interest in his case were a man named Robert Horan, who was a corporal in Albert's company. He really took an interest in Albert's case and really looked out for him, did some good stuff. He was pretty important in helping the Pension Bureau track down some other comrades who could testify on his behalf. The other one was a man named Charles Ives, who was lieutenant of Albert's company, and he had moved to Nebraska recently, but upon hearing about Albert's case, traveled all the way to Quincy, Illinois to meet him and speak with him and testify. So those are some of his comrades who really looked out for him. 1914, to get back to the insane asylum. He's committed there on account of his dementia, which was fairly common practice for the time. In the wonderful days of the early 20th century, there wasn't a great understanding of mental illnesses and how to handle them. But the real problem that arose when he went to the asylum is they were unable to separate the reason that he was there, his dementia, from his choice to live life as Albert, despite being female. They concluded that he must have been insane his whole life, because no one would choose to live that way otherwise. So when he arrived there, they began forcing him to wear women's clothing. He, at this point, had not worn women's clothing at least since 1862, possibly longer. So in 50 years, he hadn't worn a dress. He, on top of that, had broken his leg a couple years back, so he already had trouble walking, and now they're telling him he has to try and figure out how to walk in a skirt? And surprisingly, Robert Horan, who I mentioned earlier, heard about this, and even though he knew that Albert was a woman, he writes to Charles Ives in a letter after visiting Albert at the asylum and seeing him forced to wear these dresses, how he just thinks it's so cruel and humiliating for them to do this, and that really amazes me. And really goes to show that for the people who knew him best, the people that fought with Albert and knew him after the war, he really was seen as a man. So, wearing this dress, he one day trips over his skirt and breaks his hip. And for the rest of his time at the asylum, he is confined to his bed because of that accident. Then, in October of 1915, he dies at the age of 75. Now, he had already been in pretty bad health leading up to that, so it's unlikely he would have lived a whole lot longer. But it's also fair to speculate that maybe he would have, or at least he would have had a better quality of life in those last years if they had been more accommodating at that asylum and let him continue what he'd been doing his entire life. Another happier note to end on. When Albert dies in 1915, his remains are taken to the Chesbrough sisters, that family who keeps coming up, who he worked for in Sonneman. The Chesbrough sisters have his remains brought back to Sonneman, and they're buried in their family plot. Also, the local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, which Albert was an active member of, they arranged for him to have a proper veteran's funeral. He is buried in his Union Army uniform with the American flag draped over his coffin, and he is given a headstone which reads Albert DJ Cashier, Private Company G, Illinois 95th Infantry. So, further evidence that those who knew him best really didn't care about how he was born or what was underneath his clothes. To them, he was just Albert, this guy who had fought in the war and lived in their town as a productive member of the community for many years. So that's the story of Albert Cashier. A truly, in my opinion, amazing story. If you're still listening to this, props to you, because I've been going on for 40 minutes now. Thanks for watching.